Hi, this is Aviation History from post-World War II to 1970, presented to you by Cole Durkee, Aditya Shetty, and Cole Francis.
Alright, so next we're going to be talking about a little bit about the engine and VTOL technology developed in the era. One of the main developments in engine technology made at the time was the turbofan engine. It is currently most widely used in commercial aircraft, and the source of propulsion is from accelerated air due to combustion within the engine. It's extremely efficient in subsonic flight, which is why it's used so often today. It can have many different configurations and bypass ratios depending on the purpose it's intended for. It was first put into use in the early 1950s, and the primary producers include Rolls-Royce, General Electric, and Pratt & Whitney, many of which still produce them to this day. Next, we're going to talk about V/STOL aircraft, which means vertical or short takeoff and landing. First, we're going to talk about tail-sitters. They were the first VTOL aircraft used, and they mainly had front-mounted propellers that lifted the airplanes off their tails and then used elevators in their ailerons to rotate the fuselage into a forward-flying orientation, propelling it forwards. They only ever got into the prototype phase and never really caught on, and the first prototypes flew in 1954. Next, we're going to talk about the Harrier jump jet. It was the first common jet-powered VTOL aircraft, and it uses nozzles to direct its thrust downward, which would rotate to face the back of the plane, propelling the plane itself forward. It first flew in 1967, and it was developed by the British company Hawker Siddeley, and it ended its production in the early 2000s with BAE Systems in the US.
I'm now going to talk about some advancements in civil aviation. The first two planes important to civil aviation are the Beechcraft Bonanza and Cessna 172. Mass manufacturing techniques similar to the auto industry began to be used in the aerospace industry. The Beechcraft Bonanza was introduced in 1947, and the Cessna 172 was introduced in 1955. And these two planes being made by mass manufacturing techniques led to more widespread use of private aircraft by citizens. And they became much cheaper, more practical to own. And this led to the Cessna 172 eventually becoming the most produced aircraft ever and one of the most successful aircraft of all time. The first jet airliner also flew during this time period. The British de Havilland Comet became the first jet airliner to fly in 1949 and the first to offer regular jet-powered transatlantic service in 1958. It wasn't very successful though. 4 of the first 9 crashed. Then the Boeing 707 came along, and that also offered a transatlantic service in 1958, and it was much more successful. Because of the Boeing 707, 1958 is the first year that more transatlantic passengers traveled by air than by ship. In the 1960s, McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed, and Boeing were planning to develop various supersonic transports. These products were eventually abandoned. The Soviet Tu-144 first flew in 1968, and it entered service for a little bit, but was discontinued soon after due to high service costs. The British and French Concorde first flew in 1969, and it was the most successful supersonic transport, but its use was discontinued in 2003. Advancements in general aviation were also made during this time period. Aircraft became to be used more in crop spraying, firefighting, and as air ambulances. Helicopter technology also developed, causing them to come into widespread use. Sport flying developed, and hot air balloons were also more widely used.
Moving on, now we're going to talk about supersonic flight and avionics. Supersonic flight is aircraft that are capable of flying faster than the speed of sound. And the Bell X-1, which was an experimental rocket-powered plane piloted by Chuck Yeager, became the first aircraft to ever break the speed of sound. Supersonic flight led to the need for new designs to deal with the unique environment aircraft deal with when undergoing supersonic speeds. For example, the delta wing design, which was experimented with prior to supersonic, found widespread use when it's discovered that they were good at dealing with transonic shock waves, which occur when the airflow above the wing reaches supersonic before the actual plane itself, which creates intense drag. And the Lockheed SR-71 had a corrugated surface and was primarily constructed out of titanium to deal with the extreme temperatures at Mach 2. And the North American X-15 became the first hypersonic aircraft, which is Mach 5 and above. To the top left is the Bell X-15, the first supersonic aircraft, and to the right is the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger, a delta-wing supersonic aircraft. To the bottom left is the SR-71 Blackbird, a long-range reconnaissance aircraft, and to the right, North American X-15, the first hypersonic aircraft. Avionics is just electronics used in aviation, and the increase in commercial air travel and the arrival of the jet era led to the need for improved, more reliable avionics systems. For example, the identification friend or foe is a radar-based identification system that's used both commercially and by the military to detect oncoming aircraft. Heads-up display, or HUD, was developed to provide vital information to the pilot without him needing to look up at the instrument panels. Weapons aiming and guidance systems were also developed to help military aircraft in combat, and as aircraft became more sophisticated and faster than ever, technologies such as early warning and electronic countermeasures were further developed by the military to detect and deter oncoming threats. To the left is an example of a HUD inside the helmet of a pilot, and to the right, a handheld IFF device, though it should be noted that most IFFs are integrated into other sensor systems.
There are many other significant aircraft from this era that made a lasting impact on the aviation industry without having necessarily made technical improvements on the industry itself. Let's talk about some of them. The first of these significant aircraft is the Boeing 737. It began production in 1966. Since then, over 10,000 have been built and delivered, and 15,000 have been sold. It's one of the most successful aircraft of all time, and it has had constant improvements and iterations since its introduction. It is widely considered to have caused much of the development in the commercial aviation industry through the late 1900s due to its competition with other companies. It's one of the only planes used by many budget airlines around the world, such as Ryanair and Spirit Airlines, and it's based off of a two-engine system that are both turbofans. Another very important plane from this era was the Boeing 747. The 747 was the first ever wide-body aircraft, and it was introduced in 1969. Since its introduction, over 1,500 have been built. For nearly 40 years, it held the capacity record for a passenger aircraft, but somewhere between 400 and 500 passengers. And depending on its configuration, the capacity can reach over 500 passengers, roughly 550. And it can also serve as a cargo aircraft, depending on its configuration, as long as the seats are removed and it's converted into a cargo bay. And it's based off of a 4-engine turbofan system. Not all important aircraft from the era were civilian or commercial aircraft. The C-130 Hercules is an example of a military aircraft that has had a lasting and very important impact on the aviation industry. It's one of the most versatile aircraft of all time, and it has been used as gunships, as well as for airborne assault, search and rescue, scientific research support, weather reconnaissance, aerial refueling, maritime patrol, and aerial firefighting. It has 4 engines, all of which are turboprops. It's one of only 5 aircraft of all time to serve for 50 years straight with the original customer, which would be the U.S. Air Force. One of the major reasons the C-130 has been so successful is that it can land on unfinished and rough runways. Since its introduction, over 2,500 have been produced to date, making it one of the most successful military aircraft of all time.
This is the end. Thank you for watching.